The first Sunday of October in 1878 brought a hard frost to Cedar Creek, Wyoming territory, and it brought Anna Lawson walking through the doors of the Cedar Creek Methodist Church with a baby wrapped in a threadbare quilt, and nothing left in her pocket but 3 coins and a prayer. She had walked the last 2 miles from the stage road because she could no longer afford the fare, carrying Samuel against her chest the whole way, his small fists curled into her collar, his breath warm against her throat. Her boots were caked with red mud. Her hair had come loose from its pins somewhere around sunrise. She had not eaten since the day before, but she had made sure Samuel had milk from the tin she carried, warmed against her own body in the cold. She had come to Cedar Creek because a woman on the stagecoach had mentioned, almost in passing, that the town had a reverend known for his charity and a boarding house that sometimes took in women who needed work. Anna had clung to that scrap of information, the way a drowning woman clings to driftwood. She had nowhere else to go. Her father had shut the door of the only home she had ever known 3 months before, and the town of Ashford, Nebraska, had shut its doors just as firmly behind him. The church was already half full when she stepped inside, and the warmth of the wood stove in the corner struck her like a physical thing after the cold outside. Heads turned. She felt the turning before she saw it, a ripple of attention moving through the pews like wind through wheat. She kept her eyes on the pulpit, where a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples and kind, weathered eyes was closing his Bible after the final hymn. She waited until the last of the congregation had settled back into their seats, until the Reverend lifted his gaze to the room to ask, as he always did, if anyone had cause to speak before the meeting closed. She had planned to wait for a quieter moment, to catch him after in private where her shame could stay her own. But her legs would not carry her back out that door, not with Samuel needing a roof over his head by nightfall. And so when the Reverend's eyes passed over her and paused, she found herself standing at the end of the center aisle with her son against her shoulder and her voice, though it shook, carrying farther than she meant it to. "Reverend," she said, "forgive me for speaking out of turn. My name is Anna Lawson. I have come from Ashford, Nebraska, and I have nowhere else to go." She swallowed, and the church had gone so silent she could hear the stove ticking as it cooled. "I've got a baby and no husband. I am not asking for pity. I am asking if there is honest work in this town for a woman who is willing to do it, and a roof I might earn for my son." The words fell into the church like a stone into still water, and the ripples went out and out. A woman 2 pews back drew in a sharp breath. Another leaned to whisper behind a gloved hand. Somewhere near the front, an older man in a fine gray coat made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word, but carried judgment all the same. Anna felt the heat rise in her face, felt the old, familiar shame settle over her shoulders like a shawl she had worn too many months now to shrug off easily, but she did not look away from the Reverend's face, because his face, at least, had not changed. It had only softened. "Mrs. Lawson," he began. "Miss Lawson," she corrected quietly, because there was no sense in the lie living even a single sentence longer. "There is no ring, Reverend. There was a man, and he meant to marry me, and God took him before he could. That is the whole of the story, and I will not pretend otherwise to spare myself your good opinion." The man in the gray coat stood then. Anna would come to know him soon enough as Elias Prout, a deacon of the church and the owner of the largest herd in 3 counties, but in that moment he was only a stranger with a hard mouth and harder eyes. "Reverend Coles," Prout said, "I do not think this is a matter for Sunday service. There are decent women and children present." "I am aware of who is present, Elias," the Reverend answered evenly, though a muscle worked in his jaw. "I was about to invite Miss Lawson to sit and take supper with my wife and myself this evening, where we might discuss her situation properly." "And in the meantime she stands there," Prout said, announcing her sins to the whole congregation as though it were something to be proud of. "I am not proud, sir," Anna said, and her voice did not shake this time. "I am tired, and I am hungry, And my son is 4 months old and has done nothing in this world but be born, and I will not have him shamed for the circumstances of it, not by you, not by anyone." It was then that a man near the back of the church rose to his feet. He was young, perhaps 27, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath the brim of the hat he held now against his chest, having removed it the moment he stood, as was proper in a house of worship. He wore a clean but well-worn coat, the kind a working rancher kept for Sundays and funerals, and his boots, though polished, bore the permanent creases of a man who spent his days in a saddle. Anna had not noticed him when she came in. She noticed him now because every eye in the church, having been fixed upon her, swung toward him instead. "Reverend," he said, and his voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be heard. "My name is Eli Haskins. Some of you know me. I run cattle out past the North Fork, and I've sat in this church every Sunday since my mother is buried in the yard behind it." He paused, and Anna saw his jaw tighten, saw something pass behind his eyes that looked like old pain being put to new use. "I don't reckon there's a soul in this room who hasn't done something they'd rather the whole county not know about. I know I have. And I never once heard tell that the Lord's house was meant to be a place where a woman gets run out for the crime of loving a man who died before he could stand up and do right by her." A murmur went through the pews. Pruett's face had gone the color of old brick. "That is hardly the same thing, Mr. Haskins," Pruett said stiffly. "Isn't it?" Eli said. "Seems to me the only difference is she's the one left standing to answer for it, and he isn't, on account of being dead. That strikes me as an injustice all its own, Elias, if you want to talk about sin. The world's awful quick to put the whole weight of a thing on the woman's shoulders and let the man's memory lie easy in the ground." The church was silent enough now that Anna could hear the baby in her arms make a small, fretful sound, and she rocked him without thinking, the motion as automatic as breathing. "Miss Lawson," Eli said, and now he was looking at her directly, and there was nothing of pity in his face, only a kind of plain, steady regard that she had not been offered by a stranger in longer than she could remember. "I've got a ranch that needs a housekeeper since my aunt passed this spring, and a spare room that's sitting empty, and I imagine a baby doesn't eat much more than a grown man does. If you're willing to cook and keep house honest, I'll pay you a fair wage and you'll have a roof, no strings on it beyond the work itself." "Eli," the Reverend said, low, a note of caution in it, though not disapproval. "I know how it sounds, Reverend," Eli said. "I'm not asking her to marry me. I'm offering her honest work, same as I'd offer any hand who came asking. If the town wants to talk, let them talk. I've been talked about before and lived through it fine." Anna felt something in her chest loosen just slightly, some knot that had been drawn tight since Ashford, since her father's face closing like a shutting door, since the long gray weeks on the stagecoach with Samuel's small weight the only warm thing in a cold world. She did not know this man. She did not know if she could trust the offer, or whether trusting it might cost her more than she had left to give. But she knew the alternative was the frost outside and the coins in her pocket that would not buy a night's lodging pass tomorrow. "I don't take charity, Mr. Haskins," she said carefully, "but I know how to keep a house, and I can cook, and I'll work harder than any hand you've had because I've got a reason to." "Then it's settled, provided the Reverend doesn't object to a woman living under a bachelor's roof without a chaperone," Eli said, and a faint, wry warmth crept into his voice for the first time. "He does object somewhat," Reverend Coles said, though there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth now. "But my wife and I will call on the ranch regular enough to satisfy anyone's notion of propriety, and Widow Thorne runs a respectable boarding house 2 miles nearer town, if Miss Lawson would rather lodge there and walk out to work by day." "I'll walk," Anna said quickly, because even in her desperation she understood the shape of the gossip that would follow her otherwise, and she had had enough of being talked about to last a lifetime. Pruett sat down heavily, his mouth a thin line, but he said nothing further, and the congregation began, slowly, to breathe again, to shift, to whisper in smaller voices now, less about scandal and more about the strange turn the morning had taken. Anna stood in the aisle with her son against her shoulder and looked at the cowboy who had stood up for her, a stranger who owed her nothing, and felt for the first time in months something that was not quite hope, but stood very near to it. The Reverend came down from the pulpit and took her hand in both of his, an old man's hands, warm and dry as paper. "Come, Miss Lawson," he said gently. "Let us get you and that boy something warm to eat, and we will sort the rest after." Eli Haskins did not approach her then. He only nodded once, settled his hat back upon his head, and walked out into the cold with the rest of the congregation, though Anna noticed, or thought she noticed, that he lingered near the church steps a moment longer than the others, as though waiting to see that she was truly cared for before he rode away. Widow Thorne's boarding house sat at the edge of Cedar Creek proper, a two-story clapboard building with a wide porch, and a sign that read simply lodging in hand-painted letters gone soft with weather. Abigail Thorne herself was a stout, quick-eyed woman of 50 who had buried 2 husbands and outlived both without much complaint, and she took one look at Anna standing in her doorway that evening, pale and swaying with exhaustion, and did not ask a single question before ushering her inside. "Reverend Coles sent word ahead," Abigail said, bustling Anna toward the kitchen, where a pot of stew sat warming on the stove. "Said you'd be needing a room and a hot meal, and I don't turn away a woman with a baby on a night like this, not for love nor money nor the opinions of Elias Prout. God forgive me for saying his name in my own kitchen." Anna laughed despite herself, a small, cracked sound, the first laugh to escape her in longer than she could remember, and Abigail's eyes crinkled with satisfaction at having drawn it out of her. "You'll take the room at the top of the stairs," Abigail went on, ladling stew into a bowl. "It's small, but it catches the morning sun, and there's a cradle in the attic from my own children that we can bring down for the little one. What's his name?" "Samuel," Anna said, and something in her throat caught as she said it, because it was the first time in Cedar Creek she had said his name to someone who asked with warmth rather than judgment in their voice. "Samuel," Abigail repeated, peering down at the baby who blinked up at her with wide, solemn eyes. "A good, strong name. He's got his mother's chin, I'd wager, whatever else he's got." Anna did not correct her, did not say that Samuel's chin, his dark hair, the particular tilt of his brow when he frowned in his sleep, all of it belonged to a man named Daniel Marsh, who lay buried now beneath a stand of cottonwoods outside Ashford, killed by a stampeding herd 3 weeks before he meant to stand before a preacher and make an honest woman of her. She had told that story enough times now, to her father, to the church back home, to the Reverend here that very evening over a plate of cold chicken and bread, and each time it wore a little more of her down in the telling, the way water wears a stone. She was grateful, for once, simply to eat. She told Abigail only the barest outline as she ate, that she had loved a man, that he had died before the wedding, that her own family had turned her out rather than bear the shame of an unmarried daughter with child. Abigail listened without interrupting, without the small clicks of disapproval Anna had come to expect, and when the story was done she only reached across the table and squeezed Anna's hand once hard and said, "Well, you're here now and there's decent folk in this town, whatever Elias Prout would have you believe. You eat and sleep, and tomorrow you'll start fresh at the Haskins place and we'll see how the rest of it sorts itself out." "You know Mr. Haskins?" Anna asked. "Everyone knows Eli," Abigail said, and something in her tone made Anna look up. "Good man. Had a rough go of it a few years back, engaged to a girl from Cheyenne, Sarah Whitcomb, pretty thing, but she took up with a dry goods merchant who had more money than Eli's cattle would ever bring in, and she left him standing at the church with the banns already read. Town talked about that for the better part of a year." Abigail shook her head. "He took it hard, quiet-like, the way some men do, kept to himself more after that. But he's steady and he's fair, and he's got more decency in him than half the deacons in that church, if you want my opinion, which I know you didn't ask for." Anna turned this new knowledge over as she climbed the stairs that night, Samuel finally asleep against her shoulder, the cradle Abigail had promised already fetched down, and made up with a soft quilt smelling faintly of cedar and lavender. A man who had been left standing, humiliated before the whole town, and yet the very next thing he had done upon seeing her humiliation was to stand up in church and offer her a hand rather than a closed door. She did not know what to make of that kindness, only that it settled somewhere warm in her chest as she lay down at last, and for the first time in 3 months she slept without dreaming of the road. The Haskins ranch sat some 4 miles north of town, along a wide bend of Cedar Creek itself, a modest spread of perhaps 2,000 acres with a low, sturdy ranch house built of hewn logs, a barn twice the size of the house, and corrals that stretched out toward hills gone gold and rust with the last of autumn. Anna walked out the next morning with Samuel bundled against the cold, following Abigail's directions along the wagon road, and arrived just as the sun was climbing over the eastern ridge to find Eli Haskins already up and working, mending a length of fence with a hired hand who introduced himself, grinning, as Tobias Reed, though everyone just called him Toby. "Morning, Miss Lawson," Eli said, straightening from his work and pulling off his gloves before offering his hand, an oddly formal gesture that made Anna's mouth twitch despite herself. His hand, when she took it, was rough with callus and warm despite the cold. "I wasn't certain you'd come. I don't break my word, Mr. Haskins," she said, "even when I'm not entirely certain of the man I'm giving it to." Something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, or a rueful sort of amusement, and he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Come on up to the house. I'll show you where things are kept, and you can tell me if the wages I mentioned suit you." The house, inside, bore the particular emptiness of a home that had once been well kept, and had since fallen into the careless order of a bachelor's habit-dishes stacked, but unwashed. A fine quilt folded over the back of a chair gone dusty with disuse. A woman's touch evident in the curtains and the careful joinery of the shelves, but absent now in the day-to-day keeping of the place. Eli showed her the kitchen, the small room off the back that would be hers and Samuel's, the well out behind the house, the root cellar stocked for winter, all with the brisk, slightly awkward efficiency of a man unused to explaining his own home to a stranger. "My Aunt Louisa kept house here since my mother passed, going on 8 years now," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway while Anna set Samuel down in a basket she had brought. "She died this past spring, of a lung fever that took hold quick. I've been managing since, more or less, though Toby'll tell you it's less than more. He got wormy oats into a lady's flour barrel last month trying to bake his own bread," Toby called cheerfully from where he was unsaddling a horse near the barn, close enough to have overheard. "Near put himself in the ground, boss, and there's a joke in there somewhere about a man near dying twice in 1 year for the sin of trying to feed himself." "Nobody asked you, Toby," Eli said, though without heat, and Anna found herself smiling for the second time in as many days. "I can have this kitchen in order by supper," she said, "and I'll want to know your preferences, what you eat, what you don't, how you take your coffee, though I expect I'll learn that quick enough regardless." "Black," Eli said, "and I'm not particular about food so long as there's plenty of it." "I work hard, Miss Lawson, and Toby works harder, whatever he says otherwise, and hungry men aren't much good at mending fence." "Understood, Mr. Haskins." "Eli," he said, "if we're to share a roof, however loosely, I'd as soon not spend the winter being called Mr. Haskins every time you need the salt passed." "Then Eli," Anna said, and found the name sat easier on her tongue than she expected. "And you'll call me Anna, I suppose, though I warn you I answer to Miss Lawson from long habit and might not notice the difference for a week or two." "I'll manage," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, he smiled, not broadly, but enough that she saw the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen, enough that she understood Abigail Thorne had not exaggerated when she called him a good man. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Anna had not known she was starving for until she had it. She woke before dawn to start the stove and have coffee ready by the time Eli and Toby came in from the first round of chores, fed Samuel, and set him in his basket near the hearth, where he could watch the business of the kitchen with his wide, solemn eyes, cooked and cleaned and mended clothes, and in the slow hours of the afternoon while Samuel napped, took to walking the fence line with Eli when he had need of an extra pair of hands to hold wire or fetch tools, simply for the pleasure of the fresh air, and, though she did not quite admit this to herself yet, for the pleasure of his company. Eli, for his part, proved himself steady in all the ways Abigail had promised. He never once made Anna feel the weight of her circumstance in his own house, never once brought up Samuel's father or the manner of his conception, never once looked at her with the particular pity or contempt she had grown so used to enduring in Ashford. He was, if anything, unusually gentle with the baby, a fact that struck Anna as strange in a man who spent his days wrestling steers and mending barbed wire, until one evening, sitting by the fire while she darned a shirt and he oiled a bridle, he told her why. "I had a brother," he said, not looking up from his work, "younger than me by 6 years, named Caleb, died of the diphtheria when he was near about the age your Samuel is now. My mother never rightly recovered from it, not fully, not even years after. I remember holding him before he took sick, thinking I'd never seen anything so small and so much trouble at once." He paused, working a bit of oil into the leather with slow, deliberate strokes. "I don't reckon I've held a baby since, not until yours started reaching for my collar buttons every time I come in from the barn." "He likes shiny things," Anna said softly. "He'll grab at anything that catches the light." "He's got good taste then," Eli said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, and Anna, watching him in the firelight, felt something in her chest turn over slowly, like a wheel beginning to move after long stillness. It was not long after that the town began, in earnest, to talk. Cedar Creek was not a large place, and news of a fallen woman taking up residence at a bachelor's ranch, chaperoned or not by the occasional visit of the Reverend's wife, was too rich a subject for gossip to leave untouched. Anna felt the weight of it most acutely at the general store, where she went once a week for supplies, and where the women gathered near the counter grew suddenly quiet, or suddenly loud with pointed remarks, whenever she came through the door. "I heard she's been there near 2 months now," one woman said, not quite low enough, as Anna sorted through a bin of dried beans, "and no chaperone to speak of beyond the Reverend's wife dropping by of a Sunday." "Well, what do you expect?" said another. "A woman who'd let a man take liberties before marriage isn't likely to draw a firm line now, is she?" Anna's hands stilled over the beans. She did not turn around. She had learned in Ashford that turning around only invited more, that the surest way to survive such talk was to let it wash over her like water over stone, wearing at her but never quite breaking her open where they could see the crack. But it was harder here, in this new town where she had begun, despite herself, to hope for something better. "Constance Whitfield seems to think Eli's made a fool of himself over her," the first woman went on, and at that name Anna's ears pricked despite herself. "Poor girl's had her eye on him a full year now, ever since that Whitcomb business, and here he goes taking in a woman with another man's baby instead. Constance's uncle is fit to be tied about it. That's Elias Prout, you understand, the deacon." Anna paid for her beans in silence and walked the 4 miles home with her chin high and her eyes stinging only a little in the wind, and she said nothing to Eli that evening of what she had overheard, though she found herself watching him more closely at supper, wondering for the first time what claim, if any, this Constance Whitfield might have staked upon his heart before Anna Lawson had ever walked through the church doors. She did not have to wonder long. Constance came to the ranch herself, not 2 weeks later, ostensibly to deliver a basket of preserves from her aunt, though the visit had the unmistakable shape of a reconnaissance mission. She was a handsome young woman of perhaps 20, fair-haired and neatly dressed in a way that spoke of money and leisure Anna had never known, and she looked Anna up and down on the porch with a cool, assessing gaze before her mouth curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You must be Miss Lawson," Constance said. "I've heard so much about you. I imagine you have, Anna said evenly. Won't you come in? Eli's out with the herd, but he should be back within the hour. Oh, I won't stay, Constance said, though she made no move to leave, glancing past Anna into the house with evident curiosity. I only wanted to bring these preserves. My aunt makes them every fall, and Eli's always been fond of the peach. She let the sentence hang there, weighted with implication, and Anna, despite herself, felt the old shame rising in her again, the sense of being an intruder in a story that had already been written before she arrived. That's kind of you, Anna said. I'll see he gets them. You know, Constance said, her voice dropping into something almost confiding, Eli's a good man. Too good, some might say, for his own sense. He's the sort who'd take in a stray dog if it came to his door hungry enough, whatever the dog's history. She smiled again, sweetly, cruelly. I only hope you understand the difference between his charity and his affection, Miss Lawson. It would be a shame for anyone to mistake one for the other. Anna held her gaze steadily, though her heart was pounding. I understand the difference quite well, Miss Whitfield. I've had occasion to learn it the hard way, same as most women have, one time or another. If you'll excuse me, I've a baby who'll be waking for his feeding shortly. Constance's smile thinned, but she said nothing further, only turned and made her way back to her waiting buggy with the particular grace of a woman accustomed to having the last word and finding herself, for once, without one. Anna watched her go and then stood a long moment on the porch, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, turning Constance's words over and over, wondering how much of Eli's kindness toward her was, in fact, only kindness, and how much, if any, might be something more, and whether she had any right at all to hope for the latter. She did not have long to wait for an answer, though it came in a manner she could never have predicted. It was early November, the first real snow of the season lying thin and white over the yard, when a rider came up the road at a hard gallop, and Toby, who had been splitting wood near the barn, called out a warning that brought Eli running from the house with his rifle already in hand. Anna, watching from the kitchen window with Samuel on her hip, felt her stomach drop at the sight of the man swinging down from his horse, not an outlaw, as her first frightened thought had suggested, but a well-dressed older man she did not recognize, his face grim beneath a fine hat, accompanied by a second rider who held back near the gate. "I'm looking for Anna Lawson," the man called out, and something in his voice, in the shape of his jaw, struck Anna with sudden, sick recognition even before Eli turned to look back toward the house. "Horace Marsh," she breathed, and set Samuel down hastily in his basket before hurrying out onto the porch, her heart hammering. Horace Marsh was Daniel's father, a rancher of considerable means from the town of Larkspur, some 60 miles distant, and Anna had met him only once before, at Daniel's funeral, where he had stood stiff and dry-eyed at the graveside and had not so much as looked at her, though she had been carrying his grandson beneath her heart even then, a fact she had not yet dared to make known to anyone but her own mirror. "Mrs. Marsh sent me," Horace said, his eyes moving from Anna to the house behind her with an expression she could not read. "We heard, some weeks back, that you'd had the child, and that you'd left Ashford under circumstances your father was not inclined to discuss with us. Some doing to trace you here. Why have you come, Mr. Marsh?" Anna asked, and she was proud later of how steady her voice remained, though her hands, hidden in her apron, were shaking. "He's my son's boy," Horace said. "Daniel's. Whatever came before, whatever your father thinks of you, that child carries the Marsh name in his blood, and Lucinda, my wife, she's not been right since Daniel passed, and she's got it in her head that the boy ought to come to us, that we could give him a life, schooling, land someday. Whatever a woman alone and unmarried could never provide." The words struck Anna like a blow, worse for being delivered so plainly, without cruelty, only the cold certainty of a man who believed himself entirely in the right. "He is my son," Anna said, and now her voice did shake, though with anger rather than fear. "I carried him. I have cared for him every day since he was born, fed him, sat up with him through fevers, walked 200 miles rather than see him raised in shame in a town that would never let either of us forget it. I will not hand him over because you've decided, after the fact, that you'd like a grandson to ease your wife's grief. You'll have no legal ground to stand on, Miss Lawson, Horace said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a man used to being obeyed. You're unmarried, without means, without family willing to vouch for your character. A judge would see the sense of placing the boy with a respectable family who can provide. She has means, and she has family willing to vouch for her, Eli said, stepping forward, and Anna turned to find him standing just behind her shoulder, his rifle now lowered but his jaw set hard as stone. She's under my roof, Mr. Marsh, and she has been for 2 months, working honest, and if it's a husband and a name you think the boy needs to be safe from a judge's ruling, then I'd like the record to show he's about to have one. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She turned to stare at him, and he looked back at her, not at Horace Marsh, not at the second rider still waiting by the gate, but at her, and his eyes held something steady and certain that she had not seen there before, not even in their quietest evenings by the fire. Eli, she said low, you don't have to. I'm not saying it because I have to, he said, and though his voice was pitched for her alone, it carried clear enough in the cold air that Horace Marsh heard every word. I'm saying it because I mean it, and I should have said it a good deal sooner than this, though I'll grant the timing's poor and the company worse. He turned back to Horace. Miss Lawson and I intend to be married, Mr. Marsh, as soon as the Reverend can see it done proper, and the boy will be raised as my son, with my name on my land, loved every day of his life by 2 parents who chose him, which is a good deal more than most children get, blood or no blood. You're welcome to bring that before any judge in the territory. Horace Marsh studied Eli for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then looked at Anna, at the baby now visible through the open door behind her, awake and fussing softly in his basket. May I see him? Horace asked, and something in his voice had changed, had gone quieter, and Anna understood with a sudden pang of unexpected sympathy that grief had brought this man 60 miles on a cold morning, grief as much as pride. She hesitated, then nodded, and stepped back to let him into the house. Horace Marsh crossed to the basket slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the child within, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a small, determined frown that Anna had seen 100 times on Daniel's own face in the years she had loved him. He has Daniel's chin, Horace said, very quietly, and something in his composure finally cracked, just slightly, just enough that Anna saw the grief he had buried since the funeral rise up in his throat. Lucinda will want to know. She'll want to see him, Miss Lawson, whatever else is decided today. She's his grandmother. That much is true regardless of paper or preacher. She's welcome to visit, Anna said, softening despite herself, despite the fear that had gripped her only minutes before. I would never keep a grandmother from her grandson, Mr. Marsh. I only ask that you trust us, to raise him well and not seek to take him from the only home and mother he has ever known. Horace was quiet a long moment, looking down still at the sleeping child, and then he straightened and nodded once slowly. I'll speak to Lucinda, he said. I came prepared to bring the boy home by force of law if I had to, Miss Lawson, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I did not expect to find him so plainly loved, nor to find a man willing to stand up and claim him as his own before he'd even said his vows. He glanced at Eli. That says something, Mr. Haskins, I'll not deny it. It ought to say something, Eli replied evenly. It's the truth. Horace Marsh left within the hour, his second rider a hired man from Larkspur, it transpired, brought along for the journey and nothing more sinister following behind, and the yard fell quiet again beneath the thin snow, and Anna found herself standing on the porch with her heart still hammering, staring at Eli Haskins as though seeing him for the first time. You didn't have to say that, she said finally, when the sound of hooves had faded entirely down the road. About marrying me. I know, Eli said. Then why did you? He was quiet a moment, turning his hat over in his hands, and when he spoke again his voice had lost some of its earlier steel, had gone soft and almost uncertain, a tone she had not heard from him before. Because it's true, Anna. I've been telling myself for 2 months that I took you in because it was the decent thing to do, and because I felt for you, and because I remembered what it was to be talked about and found it a hard thing to watch happen to somebody else. All of that's true enough. But it isn't the whole truth, and I expect you know that as well as I do, watching me stumble through it just now. He looked up at her. I look forward to supper every evening on account of you'll be at the table. I find myself listening for your voice when I'm out mending fence, imagining what you'd say about the weather or the cattle or whatever foolish thing Toby's done that week. I've grown fond of that boy in there in a way I didn't know I had room left in me for, not since Caleb. And I expect, if I'm honest, I've grown a good deal more than fond of his mother. Anna's eyes filled unexpectedly, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment before she could trust her voice. I didn't come here looking for that, she said. I came here looking for work and a roof and enough dignity to raise my son without the whole world spitting on him for something that was never his fault. I didn't dare hope for anything more than that. And now? Eli asked, and there was something almost boyish in the way he asked it. For all his 27 years and his steady hands and his rancher's squint against the winter sun. Now, Anna said, and found she was smiling through the tears standing in her eyes. I think I have been falling in love with you for some weeks now, Eli Haskins, and trying very hard not to notice it, on account of Constance Whitfield informing me rather pointedly that I oughtn't mistake your charity for your affection. Eli's brows rose. Constance said that to you. She brought peach preserves and a warning in the same basket, Anna said. I ate the preserves. I am inclined to disregard the warning. Something like a laugh escaped him, low and warm, and he closed the distance between them on the porch, close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar above his left brow she had never asked about, the particular warmth of his gaze when it settled on her face and did not look away. Anna Lawson, he said, I am not offering to marry you because Horace Marsh showed up with a lawyer's threat in his coat pocket, and I am not offering because it's the decent thing to do, though I expect it is that too. I am asking because I want you for my wife truly, and I want Samuel for my son truly, and I have wanted both those things for longer than I let myself admit, right up until I heard myself saying it to a stranger in my own front yard. He reached out tentatively and took her hand. Will you marry me? Not for the sake of a judge or a town's gossip or anyone's opinion but our own. Yes, Anna said, before he had even finished the question, and then, laughing through the tears now spilling freely down her cold cheeks, yes, Eli, I will. They were married 2 weeks later, on a bright, cold Saturday in late November, in the same small church where Anna had once stood in the center aisle and confessed her shame to a room full of strangers. This time the church was full again, but the whispers that had greeted her the first time had given way, in the weeks since, to a curiosity that had softened, town by town, household by household, into something closer to warmth. For word had spread of Horace Marsh's visit, of Eli's declaration in the yard, of the steady, uncomplaining way Anna had gone about her work at the ranch all autumn. And even the hardest gossips in Cedar Creek found it difficult to keep condemning a woman whom the town's most eligible bachelor had chosen, plainly and publicly, to marry. Reverend Cole stood at the front of the church with his Bible in hand and a broad smile creasing his weathered face, and Abigail Thorne sat in the front pew with Samuel on her lap, dressed in a small white gown she had sewn herself for the occasion, cooing softly whenever the ceremony grew too solemn for his 4-month-old patience. Toby Reed stood as Eli's best man, grinning so wide throughout the vows that the Reverend was obliged to pause once and ask him, with mock severity, whether he intended to laugh through his own wedding someday too. Even Constance Whitfield attended, seated near the back beside her stone-faced uncle, and though her expression remained cool throughout the ceremony, she did not stay for the modest supper afterward at the boarding house, and no one remarked upon her absence beyond a few knowing glances quickly suppressed. Anna wore a dress of pale blue wool that Abigail had helped her sew from fabric purchased with her first month's wages, simple but well made. And when Eli turned to look at her as she came up the aisle, this time not in shame but in hope, this time not alone but soon to be entirely his, she saw in his face an expression of such open, unguarded happiness that she nearly forgot to breathe. "I, Eli Haskins, take thee, Anna Lawson," he said, his voice steady though his hands, she noticed, trembled slightly as he held hers, "to be my lawful wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." "I, Anna Lawson, take thee, Eli Haskins," she answered, and her own voice caught only once on the word cherish because it was a word she had not expected ever to have spoken over her again, not after Ashford, not after her father's closed door. "To be my lawful husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Reverend Coles pronounced them man and wife, and Eli kissed her gently, briefly, in front of the whole gathered congregation. And when they turned to face the church together, Samuel let out a delighted crow from Abigail's lap, as though he understood in his own small way that something had been set right in the world. The winter that followed was the happiest Anna had ever known. The ranch house, which had felt half empty when she first arrived, filled now with the sounds of a family finding its shape. Samuel's laughter, as he learned to crawl across the kitchen floor, Eli's low voice singing him to sleep with old trail songs learned from his own father years before, the particular comfort of falling asleep each night beside a man who reached for her hand in the darkness, as though he could not quite believe his own good fortune even in his sleep. Lucinda Marsh came to visit in December, alone, her husband having stayed behind in Larkspur, and wept openly the first time she held her grandson. And Anna, watching her, found she could not hold on to any lingering resentment toward the woman, only a kind of sorrowful understanding, for grief made fools and desperate creatures of even the proudest hearts, and Lucinda's grief for her son was, in its way, no different from what Anna herself had carried those first terrible months in Ashford. They came to an understanding, the two women, over tea in the ranch house kitchen, while Eli and Toby worked outside. Lucinda would be welcome to visit, to know her grandson, to send him gifts and letters as he grew. But Samuel would be raised as Eli's son, under the Haskins name, and there would be no more talk of judges or claims. Lucinda accepted this with a grace that surprised Anna, and left 3 days later with a small daguerreotype of Samuel tucked carefully into her traveling case, promising to write. Elias Prout remained cool toward Anna for the better part of that first year, a holdout against the town's slowly warming opinion, but even he softened somewhat come spring, when a bad fever swept through several ranches in the county, and Anna, who had learned nursing from her own mother years before, spent 3 days and nights helping tend his youngest daughter through the worst of it, refusing all payment, asking only that the girl recover. Prout never became a warm man precisely, but he tipped his hat to Anna thereafter when they passed in town, and once, gruffly, at a church supper, admitted to Reverend Coles within Anna's hearing that he supposed he had been wrong to judge so quickly, a confession that cost him visibly but which he made all the same, and which Anna, listening, found herself able to forgive entirely. Constance Whitfield married a cattle buyer from Cheyenne the following autumn and moved away from Cedar Creek, and if there was any lingering bitterness in her heart over Eli Haskins, she kept it to herself, and sent, rather unexpectedly, a small silver spoon as a wedding gift to Anna and Eli some months after their own marriage, with a brief note that read only for the boy, "I wish you both well." Anna kept the spoon in a drawer in the kitchen and used it eventually to feed Samuel his first solid food, and thought, each time she did, that perhaps people were more complicated and capable of more grace, than their worst moments alone might suggest. Eli formally adopted Samuel that same spring, a simple legal proceeding before the circuit judge in the county seat that nonetheless meant more to Anna than almost anything else in that first extraordinary year of her marriage, more, even, than the wedding itself, in some ways. For it meant that Samuel would never again be a boy without a father's name, would never grow up to hear the word bastard whispered behind cupped hands in a schoolyard, would never know anything but the certainty that he was wanted, chosen, loved without condition or asterisk by the man who had stood up in a crowded church on a cold October morning and refused to let his mother be shamed. "You didn't have to do this," Anna told Eli that night, after the papers were signed and they had ridden home together beneath a sky thick with stars, Samuel asleep between them in the wagon bed, bundled against the chill. "I know," Eli said, echoing his own words from months before, and reached across to take her hand. "I never do anything in this marriage because I have to, Anna, only because I want to. I thought you'd have learned that about me by now." "I am learning it every day," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder as the wagon rattled homeward, and thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely, so completely safe. 2 years passed in this manner, full and busy, and for all their ordinary hardships, a hard winter that nearly took half the herd, a summer drought that had them hauling water by hand for weeks, the small daily frictions of any marriage finding its footing undeniably happy. Samuel grew from a solemn, watchful baby into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed Eli everywhere he could manage on his short legs, calling him Papa with a clarity that never failed to make Eli's throat tighten with emotion. He was still, even after 2 years, sometimes too proud to show openly, though Anna caught him wiping his eyes more than once when he thought no one was watching, usually after some small triumph of Samuel's, his first steps, his first ride on the gentlest of the ranch horses, held tight in Eli's arms, his first clumsy attempt at helping with the evening chores, more hindrance than help but earnest all the same. In the spring of the 3rd year of their marriage, Anna discovered she was carrying another child, and told Eli the news one evening while they sat together on the porch watching the sunset gild the hills, Samuel already fast asleep inside. "Another one," Eli said, and his voice was hushed with something like wonder, though he had heard the news calmly enough at first, needing a moment to let it settle. "Anna, truly, truly," she said, laughing at the look on his face. "Come this winter, I should think. Around Christmas, if my counting's right." He pulled her into his arms then, careful and tender, and pressed his mouth to her hair, and she felt him trembling slightly, this strong, steady man who had faced down Horace Marsh without flinching and now seemed nearly undone by the prospect of a second child. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly, against her hair. "After Sarah left, I'd made up my mind I wasn't the kind of man who got a family of his own. Told myself I'd be content with the ranch, with Toby's foolishness, with Sunday dinners at the Reverend's table and nothing more. And then you walked through that church door with Samuel on your shoulder, and I don't know how to explain it except to say something in me knew, right then, watching you stand up to the whole town rather than let them shame that boy, that I wanted to spend the rest of my life standing beside a woman brave enough to do that." "You stood up too," Anna reminded him softly. "That's the part I remember best. The whole church going quiet and then you rising up out of nowhere, telling Elias Prout he didn't know the first thing about sin." "I meant every word of it," Eli said. "Every word." Their daughter was born on the 2nd of January, in the depths of a hard winter, with Abigail Thorne serving as midwife and Reverend Coles's wife, keeping Samuel occupied downstairs with cookies and quiet games, while the business of the birth proceeded above. They named her Louisa, after Eli's late aunt, and she arrived squalling and furious at the indignities of being born, a temperament that would serve her well, Anna often said later, in a household that already contained one strong-willed boy and a father not always inclined to say no to either of his children. Samuel, 3 years old now, regarded his baby sister with a mixture of suspicion and fascination that gradually, over the following months, softened into a fierce and protective affection. And by the time Louisa was old enough to crawl after him around the kitchen floor, the two were rarely apart, much to Anna's quiet delight, watching the family she had once feared she would never have knit itself together, day by day, into something whole and permanent and entirely her own. The ranch prospered in those years as well. Eli, with Toby's steady help, and eventually the addition of 2 more hired hands as the herd grew, expanded the Haskins spread by another 1,000 acres, purchased at a fair price from a neighboring rancher looking to retire to California, and built a new wing onto the house, a proper parlor, a larger kitchen, 2 more bedrooms upstairs for the children who, Anna suspected even then, might not stop at 2. Cedar Creek itself grew alongside them, as frontier towns did in those years, gaining a proper schoolhouse, a second church for the Baptists who had grown too numerous to share Reverend Coles's pulpit comfortably, a telegraph office that connected the town, for the first time, to news from as far away as Cheyenne and Denver within hours rather than days. Anna became, over those years, something of a fixture in Cedar Creek's social life, not merely tolerated, as she had once feared she might always be, but genuinely valued, sought after for her nursing skill whenever illness swept through a household, welcomed at church suppers and quilting bees, her opinion asked and respected on matters ranging from the proper way to put up preserves to the town's ongoing debate over whether to fund a second teacher for the growing schoolhouse. The shame that had once driven her from Ashford, that had once made her stand trembling in a church aisle and confess her circumstances to a room full of strangers, faded, year by year, into something distant, a story from another life entirely, remembered now mostly for how it had led her, however painfully, to Cedar Creek and to Eli. Her father never wrote. Anna had made peace with this slowly over the years, understanding at last that some doors, once closed, simply remained closed, and that the family she had built for herself, Eli, Samuel, Louisa, Abigail Thorne, who had become like a second mother to her, even Reverend Coles and his wife, who doted on the children as though they were grandchildren of their own, was family enough, more than enough. More than she had ever dared hope for on that cold October morning, when she had walked into a strange church with nothing but a baby and 3 coins and a prayer. Lucinda Marsh continued to write faithfully, several times a year, and visited each summer, watching her grandson grow with a tenderness that never wavered, though she was careful always to defer to Anna and Eli in matters of his upbringing, having learned, in the years since that first tense confrontation in the ranch yard, that grace freely given was rewarded far more richly than any claim pressed by force of law. Horace Marsh, gruffer and slower to soften, nonetheless came to genuinely admire Eli, and the 2 men, so different in temperament, found an unexpected common ground in their shared love of good horses and their shared devotion to the boy who bore, in his father's chin and his mother's eyes and his adoptive father's steady hands, the best of every person who had ever loved him. In the spring of 1883, 5 years after Anna had first walked into Cedar Creek with nothing to her name but a baby and a threadbare quilt, Eli surprised her with a small ceremony of his own devising. Not a wedding precisely, though it had something of that solemnity to it, held quietly on the porch of the ranch house on the anniversary of the day they had first married, with only Samuel, now 6 years old and full of important questions about why his parents were being so serious, and Louisa, barely walking, toddling between them in attendance. "I know we've already said our vows once," Eli said, a little awkwardly, holding a small wrapped bundle in his weathered hands. "But I got to thinking, this past winter, watching you with the children, watching how far we've come from that morning in the church, that I never got to properly tell you back then the whole of what I felt. I was too nervous and too new to it, and Horace Marsh was standing right there listening to every word, which isn't the most romantic circumstance a man could ask for. It worked out well enough. Anna said, smiling, though her eyes had already begun to sting. I love you, Anna, Eli said simply, and unwrapped the bundle to reveal a small silver locket, plain but finely made, purchased, she would learn later, on a trip to Cheyenne he had told her was for cattle business alone. I loved you before I understood what it was I was feeling, standing up in that church without half a notion of what I meant to do about it. I love you more now than I did the day I married you, and I expect I'll love you more still 5 years from now, and 5 years after that, until we're both old and gray and Samuel's got children of his own running underfoot to remind us how quick the years go. He fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers steady now, sure, and inside, when she opened it, she found 2 small portraits, one of Samuel, one of Louisa, painted by a traveling artist who had passed through Cedar Creek the previous autumn. There's room enough in that locket for one more picture, should we ever need it, Eli added, with a look that made Anna laugh through her tears. Is that your way of asking whether I'd consider a third? She said. I'm not opposed to the notion, Eli admitted, grinning now, though I'll leave the final decision to you, seeing as you're the one who'd be doing the considerable work of it. Their third child, a boy they named Thomas after Eli's own father, was born the following spring, and their fourth, a girl named Grace, 3 years after that, rounding out a family that filled the Haskins ranch house with noise and laughter, and the particular chaos of small children underfoot, much to the quiet, abiding joy of both parents, who had each, in their own way, once believed themselves destined for lonelier lives than the one they had together built. Samuel grew into a steady, capable young man, apprenticed in his teenage years to Toby Reed, who had never married and had, by then, become something like an uncle to all the Haskins children, teaching Samuel everything he knew of horses and cattle, and the particular art of telling a story well around a campfire. He knew, by the time he was old enough to understand it fully, the story of his birth, that his blood father had been a young man named Daniel Marsh who had died before he could marry Anna, that his name and his home and the steady, unwavering love of the man he called Papa had come to him not through blood but through choice, freely given. And he carried this knowledge, Anna was gratified to see, not as a wound but as a kind of quiet pride, understanding in a way few children his age could. How deliberately and completely he had been chosen. Some fathers just get handed their children by the accident of birth, Eli told him once, when Samuel, perhaps 12 years old by then, had asked him directly why he had married Anna, knowing already that Samuel was not his own by blood. I got to choose you, Samuel. Walked into that decision with my eyes wide open, knowing full well what I was taking on, and I've never once regretted a single day of it. That's a different thing than being handed a child, and I'd argue it's no less real for being chosen rather than born to. Samuel, grown and grave beyond his years in that moment, had only nodded and hugged his father tightly, and never asked the question again, having received, evidently, the answer he needed. Anna kept, throughout all those years, a small wooden box in the bottom drawer of her dresser, containing the few mementos of her life before Cedar Creek, a faded photograph of Daniel Marsh, taken not long before his death, a letter from her mother written years before her mother's own passing, a pressed flower from her wedding to Eli. She showed these things to Samuel when he was old enough to ask, told him honestly and without shame the whole of his history, and found in the telling that the old wound had healed cleanly enough that she could speak of Daniel now with a kind of gentle, distant fondness, grateful to him for giving her Samuel, grateful to fate or providence or whatever force had guided her, in her darkest hour, to a church in Cedar Creek, where a cowboy named Eli Haskins had stood up in the pew and refused to let her stand alone. The town of Cedar Creek itself continued to grow through the 1880s, weathering the hard winter of 1886 that devastated so many cattle operations across the territory, though the Haskins ranch, more diversified by then than most, survived the worst of it better than many of their neighbors, a fact Eli attributed with characteristic modesty, more to luck than to any particular foresight on his part, though Anna knew better. Having watched him spend long nights those winters poring over ledgers and making the hard, careful decisions that kept their family solvent while other ranches failed around them. Reverend Coles retired from the pulpit in 1889, succeeded by a younger man, but continued to live in Cedar Creek until his death some years later, having officiated over the course of his long tenure, not only Anna and Eli's wedding, but eventually the christenings of all four of their children, and living long enough to see Samuel himself, grown to manhood, stand at that same altar to marry a young schoolteacher named Rebecca, who had come west from Ohio to teach at the Cedar Creek School and had fallen, as her own mother-in-law once had, for a steady, quiet young man with kind eyes and a story of his own to tell. Elias Prout died in 1891, having mellowed considerably in his later years, and it was Eli, of all people, who spoke a few words at his funeral at the request of Prout's widow, words that acknowledged plainly the ways in which the man had once been wrong, and the ways in which in his later years he had tried, however imperfectly, to make amends for it, a gesture of grace that Anna, listening from the pew where she sat with her 4 children arrayed around her, found herself deeply moved by, understanding it as a final, quiet echo of the same generosity Eli had shown her on that first cold October morning so many years before. Wyoming Territory became a state in 1890, and Anna and Eli traveled to Cheyenne that year for the celebrations, bringing all 4 children along for what Samuel, 17 by then, and already courting Rebecca in earnest, declared the finest adventure of his young life, full of fireworks and speeches, and a general air of festivity that seemed, to Anna, to mirror something of the joy she carried in her own heart, watching the family she had built stand together beneath a sky bright with celebration. Thinking back, as she often did on occasions of great happiness, to the frightened, exhausted woman who had once walked into a church with 3 coins in her pocket and no earthly notion that her whole life was about to change, she thought of it again, more vividly than she had in years, on a quiet evening in the autumn of 1895, 17 years almost to the day after that first Sunday in Cedar Creek. She and Eli sat together on the porch of the ranch house, considerably expanded now, its wing housing 4 grown or nearly grown children who came and went with the particular noisy energy of a large, happy family, and watched the sunset gild the same hills that had greeted her on her first frightened walk to the church so many years before. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked him, her head resting against his shoulder as it had 1,000 times before, his hair gone gray now at the temples, but his eyes, when they turned to her, every bit as warm and steady as they had been the first Sunday she had seen him rise from his pew. "About what?" Eli asked, though she suspected, from the small smile already tugging at his mouth, that he knew exactly what she meant. "About standing up in church that morning," she said. "About what might have happened if you hadn't. If Elias Prout had had his way, and I'd been sent off with nothing, and you'd never said a word." Eli was quiet a moment, considering this, his gaze drifting out over the darkening hills, the cattle grazing in the distance, the light from the barn where Samuel and Toby were finishing the evening's chores together, Samuel's own young son Anna and Eli's first grandchild, born just that spring to Samuel and Rebecca sleep. She knew, somewhere inside the house in the cradle that had once held Samuel himself, and Louisa after him, and Thomas and Grace, a cradle that had, by now, rocked 4 generations of a family built as much on choice as on blood. "I think about it," Eli admitted finally, "mostly to remind myself how close I came to letting fear keep me in that pew. I was scared, Anna, standing there that morning, watching Prout tear into you, watching the whole congregation ready themselves to turn you out into the cold. I'd been burned before by Sarah, and I'd told myself for 2 years I wasn't going to risk that kind of hurt again, wasn't going to let myself care enough about anyone to be vulnerable to it. And then there you were, standing so straight, so unashamed even in the depth of your fear, and something in me just stood up before I'd rightly decided to do it. Best decision I never consciously made in my whole life. I'm glad you made it, Anna said softly, consciously or not. So am I, Eli said, and drew her closer against him as the last light faded from the hills. So am I, Anna. Every single day I am glad. They sat together in the gathering dark a while longer, listening to the sounds of their family settling in for the evening around them. Louis's laughter drifting from an upstairs window, Thomas calling something to Grace across the yard, the low murmur of Samuel and Rebecca's voices from the barn, the whole rich, ordinary music of a life well and fully lived. And Anna thought, as she often did in such quiet moments, that whatever hardship had brought her to Cedar Creek, whatever shame and fear had driven her from Ashford with nothing but a baby and a prayer, she would not trade a single moment of the path that had led her here, to this porch, this man, this family, this hard one and abundant. Happiness that had grown, against every fear she had once carried, from a single act of courage in a crowded church on a cold October morning. The stars came out fully over the Wyoming hills, and somewhere in the house behind them, a baby's cry rose and was quickly soothed, and Eli pressed a kiss to the crown of Anna's head, and the ranch settled into the deep, contented quiet of a home built not merely on land and cattle but on love freely chosen, freely given, and never, not for one single day in all the years that followed, taken for granted by either of the two people who had found each other in that church so long ago, and who had never, from that day forward, let each other stand alone.